You and FDR.
What is Bidenomics?
Bidenomics is about building an economy from the middle out and the bottom up, not the top down.
Well, that's pretty vague, Joe. Let's see what the punditry class has to say about it.
The reality of Bidenomics, and hopefully I have it the right way up, households are paying nearly $10,000 more every year compared to the same goods and services they had the year previously. As my colleague, Senator John Thune, also just said, rising inflation outpaced wage growth for 26 consecutive months. And then Americans are currently carrying a record amount on their credit cards.
I'm not going to sit here and go through all the price increases under Joe Biden because people know that. So the inflation rate has eased a little bit, but prices don't come down and have not come down. And this is a combination of pathological liars and sadists.
Here's where things stand. After all the disruption, after all the difficulty and the headwinds, we have one of the strongest economies in the entire world. Stronger than any of our peer countries, with higher growth and lower inflation and a booming jobs market, possibly one of the strongest economies we have seen.
Republicans vocally dragging Biden's economic policies, yet bragging about the federal funding and nationwide economic victories that happen as a result does not make them hometown heroes to their constituents. It simply makes them hypocrites.
Oh my. Okay, well, whatever it is, the Republicans in Congress say Bidenomics is terrible. Conservative pundits called Biden a sadist, and establishment mouthpieces think Biden is FDR. Much of what the right is saying is actually true. Prices went up, and even though inflation is cooling, prices never came back down, while wage growth has simultaneously begun to slow. That's an undeniable gap that has pressured middle and lower income earners. So, point to the right. Then again, inflation is indeed cooling, and it just so happens that it was on the heels of the Inflation Reduction Act. Are they correlated? Hardly. But it's a convenient narrative. What's real is low unemployment. Employment is an unassailable metric that will be a challenge to the Republicans during the election because most Americans are loath to make changes when they have jobs. That being said, this is a way more complicated economy than the previous 5 or 6 decades. So, half point to the left. The real story of Bidenomics is found in the data. The election will be determined by how Americans interpret the data and who does a better job selling it, because Bidenomics, in my estimation, represents the closing chapter of neoliberalism and signifies a shift to the next political era. Anyone who claims to know what the holy hell is happening in this economy right now is lying to you. The White House is trying to own the economic narrative ahead of the upcoming election for one simple reason. It's still the economy, stupid. On that, the pundit class has it right. There is one constant in American politics, in perhaps all democratic exercises. How the electorate feels financially at the moment the levers are pulled determines the outcome. Both sides have data, charts, and graphs that tell a part of the story, but only the American people can really tell you how they feel. And they'll have an opportunity to do just that, even if one of the candidates is behind bars. The most substantial piece of Bidenomics is government spending on infrastructure. Computer chips, solar plants, renewable energy of all kinds for that matter, bridges, roads, tunnels, railways. And here's the thing about Biden. Biden is a technocrat. Recall that he was in charge of the infrastructure spending under Obama's 2009 bailout, and it was flawless, but guided by Larry Summers' philosophy of timely, targeted, and temporary. Now for the obvious critique. It took a while to get off the ground, and it was a lot of window dressing, though necessary. Roads were paved, the feds backstopped state-run projects, a handful of fixes to federal transportation infrastructure were performed, but nowhere near the overhaul required and what the Inflation Reduction Act tapped into. This time around, we have a different Biden. He's not the technocrat in charge, he's the POTUS. And he's old. So we have to rely on the capabilities of his underlings to facilitate these projects. Now, for all my criticisms of Mayor Pete, as an example, I have confidence that he will faithfully administer his end of the deal. As for the other agencies, my impression is that there is a high degree of competency, so that shouldn't be the issue. The real issue, from an economic perspective, is that we're missing one of Larry Summers' T's. These are timely and targeted. Lord knows we need these investments, but they're not temporary. By design, these investments are of a different character. Under Summers, the issue was the amount of money. There just wasn't enough to go around, so that's why the projects were less substantial. People forget that 1/3 of Obama's $800 billion stimulus went directly to the states to fill budget shortfalls and to support Medicaid. Another third went to shoring up federal unemployment benefits, leaving the last third to infrastructure. It's a drop in the bucket compared to what we're about to spend over the next 9 years. The administration has dispatched officials to appear on as many programs as possible to tout a few key metrics and tease the fact that we've only just begun. So they talk about cooling inflation, historically low unemployment, American manufacturing coming back, and achievements like lower prescription drug prices for seniors. You're hearing these talking points a lot because they're true, but also it's about all they have to stand on for re-election. So why the low approval ratings? Why the concern, the stress and the pressure in the American public, images of tent cities and urban areas? When does the middle out extend to all of us? Are homeless people below the so-called bottom destined to be forgotten? People are right to question Bidenomics. The Democrats are gambling on enough groundbreakings in key states that recovery happens in swing states first and foremost. And that's by design. And if just enough signs go up, just enough shovels go into the ground, and just enough contracts start paying out to large companies, maybe, just maybe, Biden will turn 85 in the White House and blow out the candles with his oxygen machine. Actually, I think that would blow up the Oval Office. Anyway, that's essentially a wrap for Bidenomics. Nope, you didn't. Bidenomics is an over-Keynesian response to the pandemic and to make up for lost infrastructure spending since the Reagan administration, and nothing more. Monetary policy is being dictated solely by the Fed, which is just beginning to pull back liquidity, but there's more to that story as well. The Fed also continues to increase rates and is still looking to put people out of jobs in order to curb inflation. In terms of economic policy, that's all we've got. Spend a ton of overdue dollars that will pour into the commercial sector to reduce our reliance on foreign partners, shore up an aging physical infrastructure, encourage investments into a renewable future, pound the consumer with high interest rates until they send people to the unemployment line, and make the unemployed too scared to ask for a raise. Kinda seems like there's a lot missing. Yeah, like a lot. The direct child payment that lifted millions of children out of poverty? Gone. Attempts to overhaul the healthcare system and move toward a comprehensive public option? Off the table. Student debt relief? Oh well, we gave it a shot. Increasing taxes on the wealthy to reduce inequality? That went out the window on the debt ceiling negotiations. These are the policy measures that actually impact people directly and measurably. There's no guesswork involved when you have food on the table, a stable job, wages increasing more than inflation, manageable debt, and coverage in the event that you fall ill. What people want in reality is so simple that the only American miracle is that we somehow screw it up. Instead, our policies are almost exclusively oriented around corporate America. Behind all the talking points, we've got the receipts to demonstrate that Bidenomics is about propping up big business while trying to convince your lying eyes that it's really all about you. Middle out, bottom up? Try trickle down, Biden style. Here's a high-level view of the figures that you need to know to understand a little bit about the economy and where we're headed. Let's start off with my favorite, the Conference Board Leading Economic Index, or LEI for our purposes. Here are the LEI measures.
Average weekly hours in manufacturing, average weekly initial claims for unemployment insurance, manufacturers' new orders for consumer goods and materials, the ISM Index of New Orders, manufacturers' new orders for non-defense capital goods excluding aircraft orders, building permits for new private housing units, S&P 500 Index of stock prices, leading credit index interest rate spread, the 10-year Treasury bonds less federal funds rate.
And the number one indicator on the LEI is average consumer expectations for business conditions. Okay, this isn't actually in order. It's not really a top 10 list. It's just more interesting to do it that way. But here's what the LEI write-up said in July, and we'll talk about why this is so important. Quote, the U.S. LEI fell off for the 16th consecutive month in July, signaling the outlook remains highly uncertain. On the other hand, the coincident index, CEI, which tracks where economic activity stands right now, has continued to grow slowly but inconsistently, with 3 of the past 6 months not changing and the rest increasing. As such, the CEI is signaling we are currently still in a favorable growth environment. However, in July, weak new orders, high interest rates, a dip in consumer perceptions of the outlook for business conditions, and decreasing hours worked in manufacturing fueled the leading indicator's 0.4% decline. The leading index continues to suggest that economic activity is likely to decelerate and descend into mild contraction in the months ahead. Okay, blah bitty blah blah blah, right? Essentially, the LEI is signaling a deceleration at best and a mild recession at worst. Now, what's useful about this index is that it's been perfect in predicting economic activity over the last half century. One of the reasons it's such a strong index is because it combines big business items with consumer business confidence, real manufacturing data, unemployment, wages, housing, credit and market predictions where treasuries are concerned. So when several measures are pulling down, the index turns negative and gives us a predictable look forward. So if the LEI is signaling a recession, even if it's a mild one, in an election year, that's not great for Bidenomics. But Team Biden has access to all the same figures that we do, right? That's why the narrative push to convince people that things are perhaps better than they are is so critical, especially in the run-up to an election. So that's the backdrop. Republicans can smell blood in the water and are rooting for things to worsen, knowing that the next president will inherit the tailwinds that eventually pick up once infrastructure spending really starts to take hold. Democrats are hoping and praying that deceleration is the worst of it and that the artificial boost resonates in key states ahead of the election. On the surface, there's reason for optimism where that's concerned on the Democratic side of things, but it's also important to dig deep into the numbers. Take Wisconsin, for example, a crucial battleground state that Biden took in 2020, but Trump took in 2016. All hail Nettie. According to the St. Louis Federal Reserve, Wisconsin has an extremely tight labor market for several reasons, quote, including an aging workforce and a shortage of young workers interested in jobs in Wisconsin's manufacturing industry, end quote. One number, 2 pictures. So Wisco has extremely low unemployment, which the Democrats will see as a good thing as they tout manufacturing expansion in the Rust Belt. Currently, it boasts a 2.5% unemployment rate compared to New York's 4.9% unemployment as an example. But that's not the whole picture. In fact, it might work against them. Having a job is great, but having one that makes you feel secure is better. If manufacturing is lost on Wisconsin's youth and the older workforce is aging out, then low unemployment might be a sign of a shifting paradigm in the labor market, something the figures won't tell you. So again, that's our backdrop, but now we have to look further into the data to figure out what deceleration or mild recession means for the corporate class versus the working class. Let's examine a series of charts that together tell an interesting story. We'll start on the corporate side of the ledger, then we'll move to the consumer. So let's start with a super macro item that should be of much greater concern to people than it is. The Federal Reserve balance sheet. If we take a short and recent view on the Fed balance sheet, you can see that it's beginning to shrink it. Now, what does that mean? Remember back in 2009 when there was a lot of talk about the size of the Fed and how it was buying up treasuries and toxic assets? If you look at it in isolation, it's a remarkable increase, almost a 90-degree uptick as the Fed stepped in to save the banking system and essentially prevent the global economy from nosediving into a 30s-like depression. At the time, people were outraged. The bank bailouts inspired Occupy Wall Street, made Bernie Sanders a household name. During the crisis, the Fed balance sheet doubled from $1 to $2 trillion. Staggering. Today, it's at $8.2 trillion, and no one's talking about it. But, and this is a qualified but, that figure is down from $8.9 trillion just 18 months ago. So what's going on here? Well, essentially, the Fed continued its buying spree to ensure liquidity in the financial markets. At the same time, rates were so low prior to the recent rate hikes that the banks were basically living risk-free and participating in legal arbitrage. Free money from the Fed that they could invest back into the market knowing the Fed was backstopping it? It's the con of a lifetime. So where did that money go? Well, that leads us to the next chart. Total cash on hands, U.S. corporations and banks, St. Louis Fed. Non-financial U.S. corporations are holding on to about $1.7 trillion in the bank right now. About 12 tech companies make up almost $1 trillion of that, by the way. Now that's an impressive number until you consider it's down more than $1 trillion over the last 18 months, largely because U.S. companies spent their COVID cash on stock buybacks and dividends. And yet, even with such eye-popping sums going into the hands of the wealthiest citizens of the nation, companies are still sitting on 10 times the amount of cash they were in 2010 when the Fed was propping up the economy. It's important to note that these are non-financial institutions, so while there's a significant element of pandemic money lining their coffers, there's a bigger reason why companies have accumulated so much cash. U.S. corporate profits, St. Louis Fed. This one rounds out the corporate side of the ledger, and it's a doozy. Corporate profits as we speak for 2023 will be about $2.7 trillion. Now, that's down from $3 trillion in 2022 at the height of inflation and riding the post-pandemic liquidity phase. The liquidity I'm speaking of, by the way, is among the population. Remember, the real infrastructure stimulus hasn't hit the economy yet, so the biggest payouts were to small and medium-sized companies and direct to the consumers. So what did the corporations do across the board? They raised their prices, or took price, as we covered in our inflation episodes, a reference to the coded language that CEOs would use on investor calls. It's a euphemism for fleecing the public because everyone was flush with cash from the government. Outside of the inflation elements that were due to the supply chain issues and persistent lockdowns in China, the book is closed as to why inflation was so high in the United States in particular. Our companies simply stole the money out of the pockets of the American people because they could. How do I know this? Because in the year 2000, U.S. corporate profits were at $500 billion. So over the past 2.5 decades, corporate profits have risen fivefold. The government locked you in and paid you out. Then corporate America hoovered your bank accounts and forced you to dip into credit, all while the Fed punished you by raising interest rates and making car payments, mortgage payments, and bank loans more expensive. And we know this for a fact because now we can move to the consumer side of the ledger. Hey, do you love you some UNFTR? Well, if you do, you can support us by liking this video and making sure that you're subscribed. You can also download our podcast and give us a 5-star rating on your podcast app, leave us a great review, or purchase our coffee made in partnership with the Native Coffee Traders. But if you really love what we do and want to see us continue to grow, then you can support us by taking out a membership. Go to unftr.com to find out how to do all of the things. And now, back to the show. Real wage growth, Atlanta Fed. Real wage growth paints an interesting picture. While it looks like growth tracks with recessions and corporate activity, it's orders of magnitude smaller in terms of rate of change. For example, if you look at average wage growth among employed workers at the turn of the millennium, we see an average wage growth rate of a little over 5% annually. Throughout the aughts, real wages then went on a steady decline and fell off a cliff during the financial crisis. Wage growth didn't approach 2000 levels again until 2022, and then it took a huge leap forward to the high 6% range, only to find itself retrenching in 2023, where it looks like it will settle in the high 5% range, or slightly above where it was in 2000. The takeaway here is obvious when you map corporate profits against real wage growth. Despite the brief acceleration in 2022 alone, real wages in this country have stagnated for decades, just barely above the average of inflation, which means that most people really haven't gotten ahead, while corporations have been so flush with cash and profits, they've been pouring into shareholder pockets and creating extreme wealth gaps. And you can see how corporate America picks our pockets in the next two charts to quickly drive this home. Household savings, San Francisco Fed. During the pandemic, U.S. households banked a ton of cash from the government, to the tune of $2.1 trillion in accumulated excess savings. Prior to this period, savings had barely budged in recent years. Then, starting midway through 2021 and continuing through today, the same households have been liquidating these savings. The San Fran Fed estimates that $1.6 trillion of the excess savings has already been depleted. The overlords giveth and taketh away. The Fed estimates that about $500 billion of excess savings still exists and notes that there's a great deal of uncertainty as to whether this will hold due to an adjustment in the average household savings profile. In other words, have people depleted enough of their savings that they're beginning to change their buying habits? Well, this next chart would indicate that that's not happening, but that's not necessarily a good thing either. Household debt, New York Fed. In 2023, U.S. households are carrying $17 trillion in debt. Credit card debt, mortgages, student loans, HELOCs, auto loans. In 2004, that figure was $8 trillion. So we've more than doubled our indebtedness since that time, and back then rates were low. So that answers the U.S. savings question. Yeah, we might be trying to hold on to our savings by getting 5% in the bank, but we're paying 24% on our credit cards, 7% on our mortgages, 7.5% on our student debt. No matter how you slice it, they got you. And that's the story here, folks. That's Bidenomics. But that's also Bushonomics, Obamanomics, Reaganomics. Call it what you like. The corporate class is winning the race, and the past couple of years, they've been winning it going away. If Bidenomics was really a good thing, we'd be refinancing student debt and talking about more forgiveness. We'd be talking about reverting to direct child payments to ensure that children don't fall into poverty. We'd be investing into a mental health and federal housing emergency infrastructure plan, and not just into solar panels and bridges. Medicare for all would be on the agenda. So would minimum wage. Now, I realize that these things can't be done now, not in a deadlocked Congress. That and election season has officially kicked off, so that's a wrap. We got what we got from the first 2 years of this administration, and yes, it was a lot because we were making up for lost time. But to think it's enough to fill the basic needs of the American people to make them feel more secure by the time they pull the lever, I'm not so sure. For the first time ever, this might be about more than just jobs. You see, it's a long-held notion that sitting presidents, or just incumbent parties in general for that matter, don't lose elections when unemployment is extremely low, like it is. But nothing is as it was. Everything is different now. There's only one certainty that you can derive from all of these charts. Corporate America has won. It's over. The neoliberal chapter of the Republic is coming to a close, and we're entering something new. Maybe it's Wollen's inverted totalitarianism or oligarchy, corporatocracy. Whatever we wind up calling it, know this. Until we begin to see our future through the lens of class struggle, we'll never gather enough political momentum and capital to defeat the corporate class and reverse some of the abuses in power. The reason we're doing such a deep dive into the history of socialism and anarcho-syndicalism and Marxism is because history can teach us a great deal about the times in which we live. Make no mistake, the paradigm is shifting. The dialectic is resolving in dangerous ways, and the more we settle for Bidenomics or Trump's brand of economic pandemonium, the further away we move from shifting the consciousness of the working class in this country. The further we are from recognizing that the enemy isn't crossing the border. The enemy isn't teaching critical race theory in a classroom or even standing on the debate stage at the Republican primary. They're sitting in boardrooms. And for now, here endeth the lesson. Fucking cat in here? Ah! What is going on? Ah, fucking dying over here. Jesus Christ. This has never happened. What the f***?